Hi, good morning.
Hello and good morning. Thank you for letting me interview you regarding Erikson's psychosocial stages of development. The purpose of this interview is for you to demonstrate your understanding of the theory and how the theory applies to you and students you currently teach or plan to teach. The first question, or scenario that I would pose to you rather, is to imagine that I have never heard of Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. Briefly explain salient features of Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. What is the source of this information?
So Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development are 8 stages that were posed by Erikson regarding the different stages of life that every healthy individual goes throughout their life from birth to death. The first stage is trust versus mistrust. Then comes autonomy versus shame, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, identity versus confusion, intimacy versus isolation, generativity versus stagnation, and ego integrity versus despair. So in the first stage, trust versus mistrust, this takes place between infancy and 2 years old. This is when children start to form either trust through bonding with their mother or both parents, and if trust isn't, if a child has fear and is not comforted by the primary caregiver, they begin to develop mistrust. The second stage of Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development is autonomy versus shame and doubt. So in this stage, and I believe this stage is one of the most crucial in child development, because this is right in the preschool age from 2 to 4 years old. This is when children are starting to become more independent. They start to walk, they start to try to feed themselves and do all these things on their own. So if parents encourage this behavior, self-confidence will develop. If parents meet a child's independence or autonomy with opposition, this can create shame and doubt, which will make it more difficult as a child has to leave their parents and go to school. The third stage of psychosocial development is initiative versus guilt. This takes place between 4 and 5 years old, when children are actually, when they've already started preschool or TK. And this is when students start to explore and interact. They'll interact with the world. They'll start playing with blocks, or they'll start rolling a ball and seeing how things work. So having teachers or parents encourage this type of initiative and exploring can create a sense of kids wanting to continue with that behavior. And on the opposite end, if someone, like a teacher or a parent, inhibits that sense of initiative, it can create guilt and make it harder for children to feel self-confident. The fourth stage of psychosocial development is industry versus inferiority, and this is a very important stage for future elementary school teachers, because this stage of life is between 5 and 12 years old, so basically all of elementary school. And in this stage, industry versus inferiority, this is when students start to develop their own interests, and they want to show their productivity. So let's say if a child um, wanted to draw a picture of a car, and that's their interest is drawing. If a teacher or their peers is, if the teacher or peer is encouraging or gives positive feedback that'll motivate students or children of this age to continue with their interests. And if not, if they're met with um, harsh criticism or too much criticism, they will develop guilt and, or not guilt, but inferiority, and they'll decide not to continue with their interests and begin to develop a lack of motivation. The fifth stage of psychosocial development is identity versus role confusion. In this stage, this is important for teachers of students in middle school to high school. This is students ages 13 through 19. And in this stage of development, students are learning that they have multiple roles in life. They're students, they're family members, they have friends. So they start to recognize that they are multi-layered individuals. And this can become confusing, especially if parents do not let their children explore and try to find who they are as individuals. And this can create a conflict and create role confusion. So that would be if they're met with opposition. But if they're allowed to explore, then they will hopefully not have this conflict and find what their identity is. The next stage is intimacy versus isolation. So this is between around 20 to 40 years old, or 20 to 39. And intimacy versus isolation is when people start to form long-term relationships. And if they do, this creates a sense of self-satisfaction. And if they aren't, this can make people, if they have trouble making these long-term bonds, people can have this crisis where they start to feel withdrawn and become isolated. The sixth stage of psychosocial development is generativity versus stagnation, and this happens between 40 years old to age 65. And in this stage, individuals become a lot more set in their hobbies, or they feel satisfied with their career choices, and they want to give back to society. So that could take shape in volunteering or making some sort of positive impact through teaching, or so in this in this stage of generativity versus stagnation, if an individual feels that they're able to impart wisdom or give back to, or give to the next generation, they will feel accomplished. And if there's conflicts that they haven't been able to resolve and feeling that way, they will experience stagnation. And the last stage, the eighth stage, is ego integrity versus despair. In this stage, it's from ages 65 to death. And when individuals become, when they go into their older years, they start to look back on their life and think about all the things that they've accomplished, maybe things that they wish they had done. If there's a sense of feeling fulfillment, there will be this positive self-image, which is the ego integrity, and if there is a sense that there were certain things that weren't accomplished, or um, there's a lot of regret, um, this could develop into despair, and that'll basically shape an individual going into the last years of life. Will they feel happy, or will they be more withdrawn, or feel a lot of like they'll feel that a lot wasn't accomplished.
At what stage of development do you see yourself now? Why do you think so?
Okay, so the stage of development that I am in currently, well, according to Erikson's stages of development would be intimacy versus isolation, ages 20 to 40. I'm 28 years old, so I'm still in the stage of life where I'm developing long-term um, relationships or commitments, and instead of feeling isolated and withdrawn.
Explain how being at this stage of development might influence your behavior and outlook in the classroom.
Okay. I think that's a great question. I believe that probably the most beneficial stage to be in while teaching would have to be generativity versus stagnation. Because in this stage, individuals are more settled in who they are, and they want to impart wisdom or give to the next generation, which are things that I believe that I can still appreciate, and still goals that I can still set in motion. But the stage of life that I am in would have to be as I was just saying, intimacy versus isolation. So how would it influence me in the classroom? Perhaps I'll still be coming into my own as a teacher for the next few years. So I can't say whether or not that would have a positive or negative impact. But I can see it influencing me, and still like trying to find myself in my latter 20s, early 30s, as opposed to in the future when I'm in the stage of life which is generativity versus stagnation.
On what do you base this explanation?
Well, basically, as I said, it has to do with Erikson's stages and the age that I'm at currently, and yeah, how I identify with what stage I feel that I'm at right now.
Identify at what level your students are.
I think that's easier to answer. My students are all in kindergarten, so they're 5 years old. So they are in the stage of, they're in initiative versus guilt. So in this stage, in my classroom, a lot of my students are starting to explore and ask questions, and try new things, and I always try to meet them with positivity and try to encourage exploration. So knowing these stages has helped me meet the children where they're at, and hopefully help push them to the next stage of development.
Explain how being at this stage of development might influence their behavior and outlook in the classroom.
So in this stage, what might influence their behavior in the classroom is this feeling whether or not they can take the initiative. So maybe perhaps in preschool, so this stage is 4 through 5 years old, so it's TK preschool to kindergarten. Um, Perhaps students weren't encouraged to take initiative before, and that might influence how they are in my class. Um, so, like I said, I just try to encourage initiative and try to get them to the next stage.
What might be some differences between you and your students, keeping your two different stages in mind?
Okay, like I was saying before, it's basically the main difference is going to be well, for one, I would have already went through all of these stages, and where I am at in life is uh, worrying about, I guess, long-term goals and commitments, and students are just starting to explore new things, and I think that's it.
Any final comments?
Yes, I think that it's really important for teachers to learn about developmental theory, and I think if these ideas and principles were practiced in the classroom more often, uh, students would have a much easier time developing, not just in the classroom. There has to be a partnership between parents and teachers. Um, we have students for about 8 hours a day. The rest of the time, they're with their families on the weekends, on holidays, um, before school and after. So it's very important that there is some sort of continuity between what students are learning at home and what they're learning at school. We have to take in consideration that the stage of development they're in is going to impact their learning, and remembering this, I think, will help create academically successful students and students that will grow up to be successful individuals.